Hello, everybody. Welcome again. And we are so excited and delighted to have James E. Clarkson with us, who has 30 years of chasing UFOs in his back pocket. And he is going to be such a delight to listen to. So, James, your bio is so long with so much. You've been a police officer in many levels of doing many different things. So I'll let you tell your story while you're telling your stories, and let's just get on with it. So welcome, James. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful, and it's great to be here, and I'm excited about this opportunity. I get my bio in a nutshell. I just turned 70 years old, so I'm patting myself on the back for making it this far. And hopefully many more years are involved. I've always had one foot in two worlds. On the one aspect, because I needed to have a career, and it was something I was very passionate about, I had a career in law enforcement and mostly in investigation. Meanwhile, I was born in 1951. I'm a child of that era. And movies have always been a big part of my life, as well as reading science fiction. And somewhere down the line, it finally started and it all sunk in when I was about 12 years old and I was listening to a radio broadcast. They were interviewing an author named John G. Fuller, who wrote the first really good book about Betty and Barney Hill being abducted. And at that time, this was the early 60s, he had just come out with a book called Incident at Exeter, referring to a series of UFO sightings in Exeter, New Hampshire, that were just mind-blowing and spectacular, mainly because the primary witnesses were on-duty police officers. And this really struck a chord with me because I always had this feeling, even at an early age, I was going to be in law enforcement. I can't exactly tell you why or where that started, but it was always there, even through the era when I drove my parents crazy because we lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. I had long hair. At that phase of my life, the last thing I wanted to do was be involved in law enforcement. But through a long, weird story, I ended up coming back where I started, and I ended up enlisting in the U.S. Army, another thing I thought I would never do. And I was a military policeman, and I happened to be a plainclothes military policeman, which meant that I did not wear a uniform, and I did strictly investigation. And unlike many other people, when I got out of the Army, I had a skill set that applied directly into civilian law enforcement. I worked as a county correction officer, a reserve deputy sheriff. I got hired by the Aberdeen, Washington Police Department. I was a fully commissioned officer for 20 years. I attained the rank of sergeant. I supervised the fatal accident team. I was in charge of the field training officers eventually, and I also advised a police explorer scout post. So I wore a lot of hats. I like to do a lot of different things and be really involved. Meanwhile, I was always interested in UFOs. And in the first few years, it was just a matter of collecting books, newspaper articles, magazines, paying attention if they had anything on television that related to key sighting events. Everything changed for me because of a sighting that occurred late in December of 1986. This is an extremely important sighting. It involved a commercial airline pilot, Kenji Toroshi, who was flying a 747. I believe it was filled with wine. They were going to deliver to Fairbanks, Alaska. And on the way, they had this spectacular sighting of an enormous UFO in the sky that he even drew a diagram of the comparison of the size of the 747 jet that he was piloting versus this huge aircraft that would obviously cover numerous city blocks in the sky. It had smaller UFOs flying in and out of it and around it. It was one of those things where the FAA at first they said they saw it, then they didn't see it, then they did see it. Finally, as was revealed years later, the CIA and some other people showed up and said, we want all the information related to this sighting, and by the way, you can't ever talk about it. Well, that when it hit the news, it went nationwide. It was printed everywhere. In fact, I still have the public information packet that I got, the press release packet, that had all of the printed diagrams and reports and everything else. And that poor man, Keiji Jiroshi, lost his job. He was basically grounded for, I think, most of the rest of his career. Well, I called a particular phone number. And here's the strange part. It's the phone number for the National UFO Reporting Center. It's the same phone number as it is today. It's 206-722-3000. The man who runs it is Peter Davenport. He's been a close personal friend of mine for ever since 1987. What happened was the phone number is 206-722-3000. I had originally seen that phone number on the military police desk at Fort Lewis. I was a plainclothes policeman, and we were assigned to a 24-hour shift, and we worked out of the provost marshal's office, the main military police station. So during a dull moment, I might be wandering around with a cup of coffee talking to the desk sergeant or whatever, and he has this big desk with plexiglass and 3 or 4 telephones and all these cards and papers and everything that he uses on his job. And I'm up there looking over his shoulder, and I look down and I see this business card that says National UFO Reporting Center. And I'm thinking, this is a little odd. So I said, Sarge, what's this? And without even batting an eye, he looks up at me and he says, that's where we report UFOs. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then he and I had a long discussion, and he told me about being assigned to a base in Germany, and that one night they had a large UFO sat down and hovered at the end of the runway, and they didn't know what it was and they couldn't do anything about it. Well, as we all know, that story was repeated over and over again. Well, I always had that phone number in the back of my mind. So we flash forward from probably 1975 forward to 1987. We're now in the very early part of 1987, and the Keiji Jiroshi UFO sighting is everywhere in the headlines. It is a hot topic. I called that phone number, and a man named Robert Gribble answered the phone. I found out later, he was a retired Seattle firefighter who loved UFOs, and out of his own money and out of his own blood, sweat, and tears, he created the National UFO Reporting Center. And you got to bear in mind, this is pre-internet. This is like pre-everything. So he had to type out his own reports. He had to make copies and mail them out to people on his mailing list, physically mail them out, and do the whole thing the hard way, and take phone calls. Well, when he got too old to do that, he passed the torch to Peter Davenport. So I got this man on the phone and I said, I don't want to report a UFO. I want to know, how can I help? And he said, have you ever heard of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network? Well, I ended up being a member of MUFON from then until about 2017, when we kind of had a big falling out, and that's a whole other story, and I quit. And I was pretty burned out by then anyway, I have to admit. But during that time, I ended up half of that time, I became the state director for Washington State. So all of the incoming cases related to Washington State went through me. It was my job to make sure that they were investigated according to the protocols that were set up in MUFON. Meanwhile, as a policeman in Aberdeen, Washington, a sergeant, I got to know a lady who later became my wife, in fact, my second wife. And thank God I did it in that order because we're about to celebrate our 24th anniversary. But she was
Congratulations.
yeah, thank you. She is the area children's librarian. And one of the things that librarians do is they do adult evening programs. And she told me, she said, the hardest thing is to get young men and older men to come out to a library program. But you know what program will get them out and get them into attending? UFOs.
Oh,
So when I met her, which by the way was because of Bigfoot, I was up at the sheriff's office waiting to get a subpoena, and I saw this really attractive lady. And what had happened was she had this box of Bigfoot stuff. And normally the sheriff would come down every year and he would do this Bigfoot program for her. And a lot of people would turn out. It had a big plaster cast of a Bigfoot print and all these props and memorabilia were related to Sasquatch. Well, he couldn't do it at the last minute. He had a conflict, so she had to do it. So she went up to get the box of props. Well, I wasn't born yesterday. I helped her carry this box of stuff out to the car. And when I got to the car, I was overjoyed because I looked in the back seat and she had a box of UFO books. And I thought, wow, this must be fate. This is too easy. It wasn't actually that easy, but a point being, I had an opening. And eventually, several years later, we got married. But in the meantime, she convinced me to start doing lecture programs. And I had never done public lectures before. Now I've done lectures all over the United States. I've even gotten to lecture one time. I was truly honored to get to speak in Paris, France, to a group of ufologists. And that's one of my greatest experiences of my life. I love those people. But they are a wonderful audience, just spectacular.
well, I almost want to ask, what are the differences you find between there and here? But that may be a whole other story.
Well, I can do it very quickly. One of them is they're all highly educated, they're intensely interested. And of course, the first thing I learned about people in Paris is that almost all of them that I bumped into speak at least 3 languages to include English. They're highly educated, they're very communicative, and they are very interested in UFOs. And you got to bear in mind, you look at the history of France, they have officially taken an interest in investigating UFOs. I think the organization acronym was GPIN, something like that, GEP. Yeah, okay. They never had the problems that we've had, that we've created for ourselves by the U.S. government trying to pretend to be all-knowing and at the same time pretending like they don't know anything about it and that they're not interested in it. So it's been very, the public role versus the government in the UFO subject is way more difficult than it ever needed to be, but we're stuck with the history. And that's part of where this whole tale is going. Well, I started doing these lectures and I got scheduled to go to Ocean Shores, Washington. Now, I wouldn't expect any of you to know the geography, but Seattle is the largest city in Washington State. Everything in Washington State you're either on one side of Interstate 5 or you're on the other, or you're on the west of the Cascade Mountain Ranges or you're on the east. Most of the population is on the west side. You go about 60 miles south of Seattle, you get to Olympia, which is the state capital. You go 50 miles west towards the ocean, and there is a very large harbor called Grays Harbor, and it has 2 big arms. And on one side is Westport, which, by the way, is where I eventually investigated a crash UFO and a military retrieval and cover-up. And on the other arm is Ocean Shores. And it takes about 25 to 30-mile drive to get to either one from Aberdeen, which is where 2 major rivers flow into the harbor, and Aberdeen is where I was a police officer. So I'm giving this UFO lecture at Ocean Shores. There's 25 or 30 people there. When it's all over and done with, a very stern-looking elderly lady gets up and approaches me. She was known in the community as June Kaba, Kaba. That was her second married name. She had outlasted two husbands. They had both died from various things. She was in her early 70s when I met her. She was also known to everybody in Ocean Shores as a very tough, no nonsense lady that you did not want to mess with. She even went toe to toe with somebody out there that she disagreed with who literally was connected to a mob family. But it didn't slow her down a bit. She led the charity drive to get a brand new library. She basically strong armed all the people who were wealthy in town to donate money so they could build a really nice library, which is still there to this date. And if you go out front, there's a bench, and on the bench is a plaque that dedicates the library to June Kaba. Well, my wife had met her because my wife was the regional children's librarian. She knew June, and she summed it up best. This was the last person in the world that she would have expected to have a serious UFO story. But there was a whole side to June that she didn't talk about. She walks up to me out of the blue and says, "You're right. The government knows all about UFOs and they're keeping it a secret." And I said, "Well, how do you know?" And she said, "Because I worked there." And I said, "Well, tell me more." And she said, "I can't. They'll come and arrest me." And I think she might have thought at that point that maybe I would arrest her, because I did not make it a secret. I didn't keep it a secret that I was actually an Aberdeen police sergeant. I told them, I said, anything I talk to you about tonight has nothing whatever to do with my official duties, and I am not speaking on behalf of the police department. I'm speaking as a private independent researcher. Well, I gave her my business card, and I said, "If you ever change your mind, will you please call me?" Well, it took her, that was in 1993. That was in early in 1993. It took her 4 years to change her mind. Okay?
Did she ever tell you that she was thinking that whole 4 years whether she wanted to do it or not? Or
She hinted at it. Things had changed in her life. She claimed that her cancer was going away.
Okay.
I don't think it had really gone away as much as she would like to have believed. That was my wife's theory. My wife, her second career after she retired from being a children's librarian, she became a registered nurse in the field of hospice. So she knows a lot about what happens to people at the other end of life. In any event, she calls me in 1997. 1997 was one of the greatest years ever for UFOs. The only year that was better, perhaps, was 1947 when Roswell happened. And Kenneth Arnold saw the UFOs over Mount Rainier and thousands of other incredible, fabulous sightings by great witnesses all over the United States and other places in the world, I'm certain. But back to 1997. What do we have in 1997? We have, I believe it was March 13th, we have the Phoenix Lights.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Okay, that is a whole other realm. I got to be master of ceremonies at the McMinnville UFO Festival. It's been like 3 or 4 years ago, but they devoted the whole festival to exploring the Phoenix Lights. And so Peter Davenport, who ran the National UFO Reporting Center, he didn't want to be the master of ceremonies and be one of the speakers, so he invited me to do the master of ceremonies so that he could participate as a speaker, because he had stories about what happened the night of the Phoenix Lights that'll just blow your mind. The calls that he got from people in the Air Force and everything else are mind-boggling. It appears
Sorry.
that our country may have gone a couple of levels up in DEFCON because they did not have any idea what this thing over Phoenix represented, where it was from, or what it might do. And I'll just, as a segue, because this is such a fascinating one, Peter told me that if he ever got to meet former President Bill Clinton, his first question would be, pull up your pant leg. I want to see the scar from your surgery. Now, there's a reason for that. That is the night when supposedly Bill Clinton fell down a flight of stairs when he was visiting a friend down in Florida, and he was grabbed by the Secret Service and whisked away back to Washington, D.C. for surgery. Well, what if that's just a cover story? They grabbed the president and whisked him away because our country's defense posture got kicked up a couple notches because of the appearance of this enormous UFO over Phoenix. Okay, that's the first thing that the secret keepers had to deal with that year. They had another bad event coming, which was that July 4th weekend, they had the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash. I wished I could have gone. Evidently, you could not get a motel room in Roswell, and they had to hire off-duty cops from all over New Mexico just to do traffic control, because every UFO person in the world wanted to be in Roswell for the 50th anniversary. Meanwhile, of course, the X-Files is going full bore on television, and I freely admit I am a diehard X-Files fanatic. I think that was a brilliant TV series. Some of them are kind of junky. The Monster of the Week ones didn't really, they were okay, but the story arc about aliens being on Earth and cover up and all of that, fascinating, just fascinating. I think we were given a lot of things there that we may not realize how important they might be. Okay, so the secret keepers have got a really bad thing going on. They got to shut some of this down in a hurry. How do they do it? They come up with the Air Force's fourth or fifth explanation for Roswell, and they published a book called Roswell Case Closed. And they revealed that it was really the Project Mogul balloon. They had basically a high-quality weather balloon, and they hung a couple microphones off of it, and they had a system of relaying the signal, so in case the Soviets blew up a nuclear bomb, we would know about it. This is prior to, having an advanced satellite network. I think nowadays, I don't think any of the superpowers, I don't think any of their leaders could belch without it being known by the other side.
Yeah.
But back then, it was not true. Okay. Meanwhile, they also claimed that they dropped dummies from parachutes and that those were the aliens. There were a couple of things wrong with that. One of them was, if you've ever seen one of the dummies, it looks like a 6-foot-high G.I. Joe, and it's got a little plate on it that says, if found, please return for a cash reward. Okay, that's a little hard to make out as an alien body, and especially because they didn't drop them until 5 years after Roswell occurred. And to make it even better, I eventually called one of the authors of the report on the dummy drops. There were very legitimate reasons for dropping dummies by the Air Force as part of their experimental work in order to safely drop soldiers and equipment onto a battlefield. Experimenting with parachutes is an extremely important part of their work. In fact, June worked in the top secret laboratories where they developed cargo chutes for heavy equipment on the battlefield. But anyhow, I'm leading back to June. So that's the stage. The Air Force publishes the book Roswell Case Closed. It hits CNN. It's everywhere. They are blanketing. They're telling everybody, this is it. Go home. You don't need to go to Roswell. Nothing crashed there. Nothing to see here, folks. There was a lady out in Ocean Shores who saw that, and she blew. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was her making her decision. I get a phone call with no warning, and she says, I heard June's voice. I recognized it. She said, "Have you been watching CNN?" And I said, "Yes." And she goes, "It's a damn lie." And I said, "Well, good to hear from you, June." And we start talking. And I said, "How come you're willing to talk to me?" Because she started telling me all these things about working in a top secret laboratory at Wright-Patterson and how they used to issue the letters to the public to try and keep people from being interested in UFOs. And she told me the boilerplate language that they used and everything else. And I said, "How come you're willing to talk to me now and you weren't willing to talk to me when I met you 4 years ago?" And she said, "I'm 72 years old. I've outlived 2 husbands. My cancer's in remission. What are they going to do? Shoot me or put me in prison? I can do either one." And at that particular point, parenthetically, my wife and I the lady who became my wife, we were not seeing each other then. So my social itinerary was a little bit vacant. And I had this incredible opportunity to interview June. So I said, "How soon can I come see you?" And it turned out she was a night owl. And she lived in this beautiful house out in Ocean Shores. And she had done most of the carpentry work herself. She was very skilled carpenter and a gardener and everything else. Her home was beautiful. And she had all these animals that she had taken in. She was very kind-hearted despite her stern demeanor. And I showed up at her house, and we would stay up late at night drinking coffee and swapping life stories. And during this, I learned about her involvement in the UFO subject while she worked as an administrative secretary, like an administrative aide, in a top secret Q level security clearance required laboratory at Wright-Patterson. She worked on projects that were highly classified. And in other words, this is pre-internet. There were no computers, nothing else. So it was a matter of physically checking files in and out of safes. She told me that she was in charge of like a dozen safes, and her job was to issue the right report to the right person who had a need to know and had the proper security clearance. And then at the end of the day, it had to be recovered and locked up. This, of course, I have to be careful here because I'm old enough to know what a typewriter is. Nowadays, people do not know what a typewriter was, but it used mechanical keys and it had a ribbon in it. This place, an ink ribbon that would actually make the contact with the paper. This place was so classified that at night when they went home, they had to take the ribbons out of their typewriters, and the typewriter ribbon had to go in the safe too. Everything that they did was classified, and their fear was that an enemy agent could get this typewriter ribbon and reconstruct what they were typing from it. That was how strict they were on security. She told me about, she eventually married one of the security policemen. And that was kind of a good news, bad news situation. She had one son with him. He did not want her to continue in her career. And you got to think about the role of women in the workforce back then. That has a lot to do with this whole story. And she eventually left a job that she loved, even though they asked her repeatedly to stay because her husband wanted to leave the area. I think the reality was that she was a lot smarter than him, and she was probably destined to go a lot further in her career than he ever would have. Well, she ended up in Portland, Oregon. And I So I got this great story from her. There are various details, obviously, we can discuss that you're probably more interested in about what exactly did she know and what didn't she know about UFOs. But I will just tell you that what I did, as I was both her friend and an investigator, and I made it very clear to her that I was trying to do that, and she was fine with it. Anything that I could verify, I did. Like most UFO witnesses, there is a point in their story where you can't verify what they're saying. Actually, I will tell you that this is true of most witnesses. There's a certain point in a witness story where you either believe them or you don't. You know, it comes down to that. And as an investigator, the first thing you want to know is, could this person, were they in the right place at the right time to possess the information that they're reporting to you? That's really important. You know, and in her environment, did she have the right security clearance to be hearing about stuff like this? Did she work in a place like that? Well, yes, she did, because eventually she gave me all of her personal papers. And as we became friends, she did something that always got to me. I did not ask for this. I didn't anticipate that this would happen. I got a letter from her attorney with this lovely little affidavit on it that said that she was giving me the rights to her life story in return for my friendship when she needed it most. Because she was a lonely woman, and I think she knew that her cancer was not going to stay away forever. And that leads to where this all eventually went, which is when she eventually passed away. I only got to know her really well for a little over a year. And my life was very busy then. And I saw her when I could, and we communicated by phone and whatnot. But eventually, when she got down to the end and she was on hospice, the last time I talked to her, I said, "What do you want me to do, June?" And she said, "Tell my story." And that's where I got the title of the book, Tell My Story, June Crain, the Air Force, and UFOs. And I've kept that promise, as I am keeping it today by telling you. I've actually sent books to India. That's about as far away. And certainly other places in Europe. Her story is now being translated into French. I think the Flying Disc Press is going to come out with it. And as I told you before, I've actually lectured about it in Paris. I've lectured at every major UFO conference in the United States, if not once, repeatedly, most often at Roswell and at McMinnville, Oregon. I've been to those conferences more often than anywhere else. Well, I would assume you probably want me to go, unless you've got questions, you want me to go into some of the things that she revealed.
That she also entrusted you with all of her information.
With all of her personal papers, yes. Yeah. And the interesting thing was, I wasn't satisfied with that. I wanted to corroborate them. So what I did was I contacted the Air Force. The Air Force said, "We do not have records of her working there, but you should try." Well, she was a civilian employee. She was not an officer or an enlisted person. So the military, they were correct. The Air Force would not keep the records. They would be held at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, which sadly suffered a major fire along the way. And I thought at first that perhaps her record went up in smoke, but I ended up applying to them 3 or 4 times, submitting a Freedom of Information Act request. And they kept telling me, "We have no record of her being employed," etc. And I was beginning to get really just aggravated and distraught because I got nothing. And then out of the blue, with no warning, I got a thick envelope in the mail. And it was a photocopy of every document in her file, with the exception of anything that was classified. I got all of the stuff that they could release. And that included copies of all of the documents that she had given to me. So I had the originals and I had the copies of the records that I obtained from the National Records Center. So that pretty well clinched, when and where she worked. She worked for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, before it actually was an Air Force base, because one of the things that I learned along the way, and I saw this actually illustrated in her documents, there was no Air Force in World War II.
Right.
The Air Force was created by the National Security Act that was not enacted until 1947, oddly enough, or interestingly enough.
Just gonna say that.
Yes, quite a coincidence.
Oh, quite.
Boy, that sun is really getting brutal.
Yeah,
I'm very sorry about this. I'm being betrayed by the local weather.
No worries.
But
That's all right. You're being lit by God himself.
it must be.
but please go on.
All right. Well, the situation.
I'm sure it made you feel great to actually get that information. Now you know that June was where she was when she told you.
So, and then the other thing I was able to do was biographical details. She told me a really strange story about how her husband had died when they got to Portland, Oregon. They were going to go out to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary, and he was going to go out and put new license tabs on the car parked out front. And so he went out the front door to put this thing on the license plate with their son. And as he bent down to do this, a drunk in a car came around the corner and was barreling down on them. And basically the last thing that he did was to shove his son out of the way. And then he was sandwiched between the two cars and he died from his injuries.
Oh, that's a horrible death.
And I actually was able to document the basic accident report in the Portland newspaper on a particular date and time, exactly as June had described it. Her name then was Cubbage. His name was Cubbage.
So
okay.
He's not
so
lying.
everything she told me that I could verify. She told me about working on Project Caucasian. At the time that I got all of this information, which was 1998, I asked everybody, historians, anybody, have you ever heard of Project Caucasian? Nobody. Then, 3 or 4 years later, the real Project Caucasian was declassified. What was it? It was a code name for the technical project of creating a harness for a parachute to hold a hydrogen bomb as it was falling out of a B-25 airplane, a bomber. So, yeah, that was classified. You're darn right. At the time they were doing it, it was extremely classified. That's the kind of work June was doing. Well, the point being of all that, in amongst these scientists and engineers, she is actually physically handling documents that are highly classified. She's in an environment where these people talk about what they're doing. She had to have the same security clearance that they did in order to be able to do her job.
She was a very important woman.
Exactly. If you've ever worked in an office, I can tell you that if you wanted to bring the average police department to a grinding halt, have the administrative secretary and the investigation secretary call in sick on the same day. Nobody can get anything done. It'll just about paralyze police operations, because there's always people like that who everything goes through them and they keep the organization running. That's the kind of person I believe June was. Yeah. Then you got to remember this is an all-male dominated environment. And she's a tall, attractive, vivacious woman. And as we know, men talk too much around attractive women. Now there's a new concept. One of the best stories comes out of that. one of them is that one day this officer comes in. As I recall, she said she thought his name was Lieutenant Rose. Unfortunately, there are more Lieutenant Roses than you might imagine. He walks into her office, kind of sits on the corner of the desk, reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out a mysterious piece of metal. And this, of course, is memory metal. And it weighs nothing. And you wad it up into a ball and you let it go, and it like flows like water and goes back the way it was. And so he gives it to June, and he makes this comment. He says, "You're a good worker. Tear that up. Use those scissors." So obviously she tries. She can't cut it. She can't poke a hole in it. She can't scratch it. She can't do anything with it. And it doesn't weigh anything. And it has these remarkable properties. So she looks at the guy and says, "What is this?" And he says, "It's a piece of a spaceship." And she goes, "No, what was it really? Come on, tell me. Stop joking around," basically. And he bends down and he says, "It's a piece of a spaceship." And at that point, somebody else starts to walk through the area, and he does one of those, we weren't really talking things, and sticks it in his pocket and pretends like, "Oh, I don't even know you, June," that kind of thing. And June laughed when she told me that story. She said, it was obvious that he wasn't supposed to have that. He was breaking who knows how many security protocols by showing that off.
Now,
and
we have a clip. Let me know if you want me to play.
Yeah, that would be a good time.
Yeah, okay. Well, you
now would be fine.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's take a look at the clip. This is the metal clip. And here it comes.
And this was a cover-up. When this report in newspapers said, "How could such a conspiracy exist?" That's how it existed, because it was right at the very start of it. Project Blue Book was not formed to investigate those things. It was formed to stop the people from thinking that's what it was. That's my opinion, and I'll stick with it.
And somebody else was actually investigating.
Right. They were being investigated by the Project Blue Book officers, yes. But the basic thing and the reason why they was told people were investigating it and everything, they were investigating it all right, very, very religiously. But at the same time, they were telling people they were nuts or drunk or dreaming or under drugs or something. And that's what Project Blue Book was all about. It was to try to squelch all talk of the UFOs.
If I remember right, too, in the letter you mentioned that people in this group went to White Sands to do testing and then came back.
Yes.
And did they say that anything unusual had happened to them?
Well, they said they were just as thick as fleas up there. They'd sit at night, they'd sit on the outside of their motels where they would stand or the buildings, and they would just watch them go over all types and shapes. There'd be motherships, big ones with little ones coming out of it, and then they'd see them return, and they had different colored lights. Some had orange, sometimes red, yellow, different lights they would see. And then what they would do, if the people, the engineers and scientists would report it that they saw them, they locked them up in a motel for 24 hours with no access to no radios, no people, no nothing. And they'd bring the meals into them, but have no contact with anybody. And they had them to write up what they saw. And then when they come out the following day, 24 hours later, they'd have them write it up again. And like the engineer said, to hell with it. I'm not going to report anymore. I'm not going to be locked up for 24 hours.
Is that the right clip that you wanted to use?
I think so.
Because that was the clip all about Project Blue Book and what she knew about it.
Oh, you know what? You had it
also,
marked. You had it marked metal when you sent it to me, so.
Oh, that may be my fault. I did not listen to them. I just pulled the clips that I had used before.
Okay.
I'm surprised that they were mixed up.
Oh, yeah, I didn't change them. That's how you sent them. But I'm more than happy to play the other two. I mean, we have the time.
You might as well, since we're going along those lines.
I will try the Clarence audio. And if that's
Yeah,
not
it's got to be there. I can't imagine how those things got mixed up. That's so strange to me.
Yeah, I didn't change the names of them, but it doesn't matter. We have 3 clips, and we can play them.
The sergeant, his first name's Clarence, Master Sergeant. His first name's Clarence. I went to their wedding. I sent the picture of the wedding to Randall. I still can't remember that man's last name.
Okay.
But he was in charge of that airplane. And when he came to there,
what kind of an airplane?
Well, it was a regular transport.
A military transport.
Yeah.
And what was it that he said?
It came in from New Mexico. He said, "What I brought in this morning, you read. It's in here.
Okay.
I want you to read this."
I will.
And he said that he brought 2 little men in.
Okay, and 2 little men.
He called them little green men. Then he described them as a greenish blue. And they were 4 foot tall, and they were dead.
So the color could have been because they were dead.
Yeah. But see, it could have been anything.
And we're talking about non-humans.
The non-humans, right.
Did he say anything else about them?
No, not really. Because it was only a matter of 15 minutes. We were having our coffee that morning. And so when Clarence hit the deck, he told us about this. That was his news for the day.
Is this one of those things where he's kind of like, maybe, I'm trying to guess here, but were there like maybe other ladies there and he's sort of like showing off or telling? No, he wasn't showing off.
No. These guys don't show off. I mean,
this is a serious man telling a story.
When I'm saying engineers are sort of wacky, there's one thing they're not. It's not a wackiness like you'd think just being acting like a fool. It's just, it's hard to explain. But they're very serious. And they don't tell lies. They don't have jokes. They don't do anything like that. And so when they say something, they know they better be the truth. You just don't. You don't lie. You get your head knocked off.
Was this Master Sergeant, do you think, breaking security by talking about this?
No, because we were all secure.
Okay.
See, when you have security like that, you can't even take your husband to a party. We all had, if we had our Christmas party, we went and there was a guard at the door, and nobody but the people in the branch are the only ones that's there. You can't bring your husband or your wife. And when you're at home, you can't talk about your job because you got that in your head. You got security and you're cleared and you keep your damn mouth shut. That's all there is to it. And it's a big burden because there's times that you'd like to talk about your job, but you can't.
She was a no-nonsense woman.
She certainly was. And of course, you got to understand the scenario here. She told me that I could record her. I had been pushing her a little bit over time saying, June, I'd really like to get some of these things tape recorded. And at first she didn't want to be recorded. And then the night she told me, I go ahead and turn the recorder on. I won't pay any attention to it. The truth is she did pay attention to it and she kind of got shy on me. That's why she kept saying, well, go ahead and read this letter, which I have the letter. And in fact, I included the whole letter in the book for anybody who wanted to read it. She had sent a letter to Kevin Randall, the UFO researcher, several years earlier, but of course, he wasn't 25 miles away from her. He was several states away. And I guess he didn't have the time or he didn't think it was important enough to pursue what she had to say. He didn't know, I would say in fairness, how much insight she really had and how many stories she had. Mm-hmm. And the other part of the Clarence Cubbage story is that later on that morning, after they went back to work, that's when the Too Hot Memo event occurs. And I think one of those clips is about that. I'm not sure.
There's one final clip called White Sands, so let's take a look.
Okay, give it a try.
Let's give it a try. Why not? We have nothing to lose.
There you go.
Is this the same period of time I remember that you mentioned before that someone actually showed you a piece of something?
Yeah.
Was this during the same period of
Yes,
time?
51, 52.
Okay, now who showed it to you?
Okay, it was Lieutenant Rose is the one that showed it to me, or Captain Wheeler. Now, it could have been one or the other of those guys because they were both in personnel shoots. And he walked in, and they always like to rag me because they couldn't figure me out. And he threw it on my desk, and it was a piece. Well, it was a piece that's about this big, and it was
About half of about size of a business card.
Yeah, about that size, and a half of this.
Okay.
There, and it was bent like this. And he says, "June, you're a good wrecker. Tear that thing apart. Break that up." And I took it and I bent it and I twisted it and I laid it back down, and it got right back the same shape. I got my desk. He says, cut it, try cutting it. I got on my desk, I got my scissors out, and I snipped at it, and there was no way I could even cut that piece of metal. And it was as light as a feather. I had it in my hand, and I would say that it didn't weigh as much as these two cards. It wasn't that heavy. It was so light, but strong, and it was the thickness would be about, say, let's see. There's no more. It would be about that thick.
So it's fairly thick, but it doesn't weigh anything.
But it had no weight at all. It was like a feather. And so strong, it was sort of a grayish gunmetal type of color. And you could see that on the inside there was there was a coating on the outside. Both sides of it was the same. And the inside seemed to have a sort of a light lead colored center to it.
What were the edges of this like? Were they even, or was it like part of something else?
It was even.
It was
all even. And I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's a piece of spaceship." When I, got through with it, and I couldn't do nothing with it, I said, "Well, what is it?" And he says, "Piece of a spaceship." He said, "I just come back from New Mexico, and I brought it with me." See, he had no business having it in the first place, but
So he was breaking security.
Yes, he was. Definitely.
Obviously, in 40 years, and even in my lifetime, being 45, I've seen improvements and changes in materials and plastic and metal. And have you ever? Is it like anything you've seen since?
I always look at things, metal things, and stuff like that, and I still have that curiosity because it still bothers me, and I have yet to see anything that would have those properties and look like that, and so light.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I hear this stuff, and I think that I forget the committee they formed for the Tic Tac to investigate that.
Right.
And I hear things like this, and I think that the Tic Tac is nonsense compared to crash retrievals, because there are so many crash retrievals where the military came in, took something in front of a whole town, and then say they don't know anything about it. Or sometimes they will say, claim, yes, this did happen, but we can't tell you what it was. But I mean, that's what we need a committee on, are the crash retrievals. It's like I don't know. Go ahead, please.
Well, just parenthetically, I would say that I think you're on the right track, but you're sounding like an old heretic like me. You're basically advocating something that I've been advocating, which is, yes, folks, there really was UFO history before 2017. Mm-hmm. And, the 2017 New York Times article about Tic Tac is actually about a 2004 sighting. But surprise, there were a lot of UFO reports way before 2004, many of which have been thoroughly investigated. And so, to try and take what happened to June and put it all in perspective, I wish I had more. I wish I had more time, that I could have asked her a lot more questions and maybe gone deeper. I didn't have it. Other than her situation where she actually handled the metal, That in that instance, she's a direct witness. In these other instances, she is a key corroborating witness in that she worked in the right place at the right time and had the security clearance to know what she knew. She says point blank, they knew all about UFOs. They went down to New Mexico to work on our early rockets, and they felt like they were under surveillance while they were doing their work because the UFOs were watching them. This has been corroborated so many different ways by so many people. Where did the bodies go from Roswell? Any credible investigation says they ended up at Wright-Patterson. She told me, she said the rumor mill, not confirmed, was that they were in a place called the Aero Med Lab. And Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is the heart of the Air Force, even now. It is the place for them. It always was. It still is. You know, very important work is done there. They've always had all of the good stuff that we would like to know about.
Including crashed.
Yes. They have they don't call it that now. They've renamed it. But originally it was called the Foreign Technology Division. And there is a regulation that's probably been replaced, but the original one that came out in the early 50s was AFR, Air Force Regulation 200-8, I believe it is, that had a specific protocol for reporting serious UFO incidents up the chain of command, and the information was to go to the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. They've had the system in place to investigate UFOs for a long time. I mean, if you think about it, if you're the Air Force and your job is to protect the United States, the air above us, and our interests overseas, and you have any evidence that somebody else has better technology than you, you're going to do everything you can to get your hands on it and take it apart and put it back together again and figure out how you can take advantage of it. You want to know what its vulnerabilities are in case you have to go into battle against it, and you want to know if it's so good that you want to incorporate it into your own aerial platforms and your weapons systems. I mean, this is a no-brainer. They've been doing this forever. That's what they're supposed to do. This is no big surprise. And June, you know, what I loved about June, like so many other people that worked there, was she was totally loyal. She's a patriot. She was so proud of what she did. And it took a lot for her to decide to even tell me what she told me. It wasn't until she came to the end of her life. Well, we have so many examples of this, of key witnesses who they didn't necessarily make a dying declaration, but they kind of knew that they were coming down to the end of their days. And suddenly they come out with these incredible UFO revelations. What is it? Blackjack McGruder, one of the most highly decorated Air Force aces from World War II, led many, many combat missions against the Japanese. He's decorated over and over again. So what happens? He goes on in years, he retires, and he's in the supermarket with his wife, and they walk by a tabloid magazine that has an alien on the cover, and he looks at his wife and says, "That's not what they look like." And she says, "What are you talking about?" And he says, "That's not what they look like. I saw one." Well, over time, this gets brought out, and it turns out that he disclosed the whole story before he died to just about everybody in his family. And what it was he said that he and these classmates who went to a war college in the Air Force in 1947, they were summoned to a top secret facility, and he was allowed to see a live alien. And then he made the comment, he called it a squiggly. I'm not sure how he got that reference, but he made the comment that we treated it terrible. he felt bad about how this alien was treated. And I thought, where is this guy coming up with this stuff?
Well, I'm kind of thinking that too, in that treating the alien, it was alive.
It was alive.
And can you again tell us what he went to a war college? How does he get this type of clearance? This is like above top secret type of. How would that be possible?
Well, the guy's a decorated war hero.
Okay.
I don't know how they did the clearance system or what they did or why, but he claims that he and the people who were in this class, it was a special kind of class that they were brought to this site. If you want more information, this is not I'm knowledgeable in this, but this is not the June story. And this is me doing extensive reading and having spent time with Donald Schmidt and Tom Carey, who are probably the two best Roswell researchers anywhere.
Okay.
They've dug up more than anybody. And they came across this story about Black Jack McGruder. And I think, why would anybody make up a story like that? Why would his family do anything that might tarnish the memory of a distinguished war hero? And you come back to the inescapable conclusion, the reason that they're willing to say this is because he thought it was true and they thought he was telling the truth, and so they're telling everybody else. And then, boy, does that open a lot of doors.
What year was that in?
What?
Blackjack McGruder?
47 is when the revelation was. He was a World War II hero. He didn't disclose this until towards the end of his life.
Which is probably what, the 90s or?
Yeah, you can find the whole story in, it's one of Don Schmidt's books.
Okay.
I can give you more on that later.
Absolutely.
But that's a really good story. It's worth reading.
Well, I've never heard the name Blackjack McGruder, and then for him to have seen a live alien.
You don't get to be much more famous as a combat aerial pilot than him.
Sure. That's we'll have to look into that. But
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. Because I want to go back to June.
Yes, that's a good idea. I tend to wander, but that's all right.
Yeah. Do you know when she had that piece of metal in her hand? What year was that?
50. She said that in the clip. It's like 50, 51, 52 in there. It would have been at the very end of her employment.
Because they use the term spaceship instead of flying saucer. I find that interesting.
And that's interesting. I thought it was interesting too.
Yeah.
But why?
Because
they wouldn't necessarily, they might not call them flying saucers. That was a term that was invented by the press. Actually, it was invented here in Washington State.
But the gentleman that flying the plane, right? He
right.
Kenneth Arnold.
And it was a newspaper reporter from the East Oregonian newspaper who said, "Mr. Arnold, how did they fly?" And he was trying to describe this odd fluttering motion, and that's been reported by so many witnesses. And he said, well, it's kind of like if you flew a saucer over the water, like skipping a rock. And the newspaper reporter, little did he know that he was about to make history in the English language, because he cut it short in his notes and wrote flying saucer. He wrote it into the story, and it took off like fire, like wildfire. And everybody started, even though we know, anybody who studies UFOs knows the flying saucer is a type of UFO. It's not the type of UFO. And in fact, the big triangles are probably reported more often. But we've seen spheres, cylinders, all sorts of odd things.
Cigar shape, cylinder.
Yeah.
And another thing that I find interesting is because Uri Geller is on Twitter. He spoke recently about that he was I think it was at Wright-Patterson. I don't remember, but that he met Werner Von Braun. And Werner opened a vault or a safe, and I gave him a piece of metal and said, "Can you feel something? Can you where this is from?"
You know, you may
And
have
so,
you may have just discovered something very, very important to the June story.
yes, exactly.
I
So,
have not heard
yeah.
this, but I will tell you that the first time that I went over to June's house, she had all these books on the floor, and I repeated this same frustrating piece of searching myself, which was
Mhm,
she told me that she was virtually certain that she took dictation for Werner von Braun at Wright-Patterson. There's a particular
mhm,
incident in her history that was extremely important to her. It was so
mhm.
important that every time she would describe this to me, she would start crying, literally,
Okay.
because it was the emotions. What happened was she was told one night that she had to stay late. An officer came to her. In fact, she remembered very specifically that he was wearing a sidearm, and he took her to a part of the base that was highly restricted. And it is a fact that there was a compound at Wright-Patterson for a while where they confined Project Paperclip scientists that were brought over to the United States involuntarily from Germany at the end of World War II. And we do know that Werner von Braun, although he later became a household name and became very famous, and obviously in the beginning, though, he was a prisoner of war. Basically, he was here against his will, as were the other scientists, but basically the U.S. government played it smart and made them an offer they couldn't refuse, and offered to bring over their families and pay them well. And, you know, given what they were facing in a decimated Germany after World War II, it wouldn't be, and what you might be facing if the Soviets got a hold of you and instead of Uncle Sam, it wouldn't be too hard to figure out, I think I'm going to go along with the program. And obviously in Werner von Braun's case, it was the best possible decision. But you do not find very much in his biographies about his early days when he first came to the United States. And he could have been at Wright-Patterson. It's just not included because his biography has been, I think, sanitized. So the involuntary part of his history, where he was here against his will, they don't talk about that. Because, of course, one of the reasons that these people were isolated and basically held in custody was that, let's be perfectly honest, a lot of these scientists worked on projects where slave labor was used. And, you know, people were treated horribly, expendably. The Jews, the undesirables, anybody else that the Nazis had imprisoned. And they were used as work gangs to do anything that they needed doing. So obviously this is a part of the development of early rocketry in Germany that nobody wants to talk about. So there is a good reason why there may not be a record of Werner von Braun. But anyway, back to the story. June gets taken to that part of Wright-Patterson. She is told that she has to take dictation from this German scientist and type a letter that is going to be sent to Congress. And this officer tells June, and this is the part where she always started crying. The officer told her that he said, June, this is probably the most important thing we're ever going to ask you to do, because if we get the money that we are asking for from Congress, we are going to start the United States space program. This is going to be the true beginning of us going into space. And every time she would tell that story, she would cry because she felt like she had done something really, really important. Well, she was convinced that the man who was talking to her was Werner von Braun.
Wow.
She would look at his picture and she would tell me over and over again, I'm sure it's Werner von Braun, but I can't find a record that he was actually there. And she said he had very cold eyes, and His language was very precise, but he had a very heavy accent. And she had to stay until she got this letter perfect. And she felt that that was one of her big moments. And of course, then her husband insisted that she quit her job, and she left her job not wanting to go, but she did, to follow him to Portland, Oregon, where he promptly cheated on her. And then they got back together, and then I already told you about how he died.
Right.
So this is quite a story, not only of UFOs and technology and all of that. It's kind of the story of what women were going through in the workforce back then. Trying to be professional and be wives and mothers at the same time. So I love this story. That's why I appreciated June telling me all these things.
Well, this type of story really should become a movie. June's story could absolutely be a movie.
It could.
It really could.
There's even a part where she was not directly involved, but she happened to be around one night when the FBI closed in on one of her co-workers who was selling secrets.
Oh
yeah.
So James, what do you think? Where that metal came from? From the lab, or did somebody smuggle it?
I think it came from Roswell. That was what June thought. Can we prove it? No.
But again, the metal came to her desk by that gentleman,
by an officer.
By that officer. You said in 51,
51, 52, somewhere in there.
So okay, so that's like 4 or 5 years after Roswell.
Now, I was never able to figure out exactly how she came by this knowledge. But one of the things that she told me during our interview that really startled me, that I ran by some other researchers when the first time that anybody took an interest in the June story, and they were quite startled by that, was that she said that by the time she left government employment in 52, they knew about at least 3 UFO crash retrievals, of which Roswell is one of the 3.
And there is talk that there were 2 crashes the night of Roswell.
Well, that's true too. There were 2 crash sites.
Yeah.
I happen to subscribe to that theory because I think that that's the reason why they went public with the find on Mac Brazel's ranch. They weren't giving the public anything that the public didn't already know about. The real crash site was where they picked up most of what was left of the craft and where they recovered the bodies. That's the one they wanted desperately to keep secret. See, one of the photos that I gave to you in that material that I forwarded to you is a picture of Joanne sitting with an elderly woman. Her name was Frankie Rowe. And in fact, that may have been one of the last pictures ever taken of her. I got to ride around with her on a float in the annual Roswell parade during their UFO weekend in 2017. We sat right next to each other. And she was a well-known figure at the Roswell UFO Museum because when she was a 12-year-old girl, her father was a Roswell City firefighter. And he and some other firefighters went out to the crash scene and were turned away by the military. A few days later, she's at the firehouse wanting to get a ride home from her daddy, and there is a New Mexico state trooper there who pulls a piece of metal out of his pocket and shows it off to everybody. And I think you can fill in the blanks about what that metal was like. So she goes home, and of course they talk about it at the dinner table, her mother and everything. A while later, a few days later, she's at home with her mother. There's a knock at the door, and this is a very, very arrogant, overbearing military officer with 2 other MPs. They basically force their way in, and they threaten her life and her mother's life if they ever revealed the fact that they saw this metal. And years later, a younger man showed up at her front door with a bouquet of flowers and said, "I'm here to apologize on behalf of my family. The man who threatened your life was my father."
Oh, wow.
And that's all been verified.
Wow. And this was this Frankie?
That's Frankie Rowe right there.
There you go.
And
she's on the left.
we're in a hotel. We're in a hotel in Roswell.
And is she's on the left?
Yes.
Okay.
My wife Joanne is on the right.
Well, hello, Joanne.
There you go.
I remember seeing her on television saying that they threatened her to leave her in the desert or something. Or,
Yes. They
yeah.
made the comment that your bones
Yes.
can bleach out in the desert. And this guy had
Exactly.
used that threat before.
Yeah.
He used the same threat on Glenn Dennis, the mortician.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Many people were threatened like that.
Yes, they were.
Yeah.
And they were eventually able, the investigation done by Don Schmidt and Tom Carey, they were eventually able to pretty much narrow it down to one particular man whose job it was to threaten people and make them shut up about anything related to this UFO crash. So I really don't think they would do that for a weather balloon. I'm sorry. No. Doesn't work.
And James, this memory metal, I mean, the Batelle Memorial Institute developed it in the early 60s or 1960, I think.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, and the man who was in charge of the team that developed it was named Howard C. Cross. And this man, you cannot find any picture of him, any photo, but he was also dictating the Robertson panel what to do and what not to do. So it's strange that you have a metallurgist telling the CIA panel, which it was, what to do and what not to do. It's strange. And later they developed...
it's interesting how they work together.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's fascinating history. That's the kind of connection that I love.
Yes, that's a connection. And this memory metal. Mm-hmm.
It's throughout. Yeah, the memory metal shows up over and over again.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, of course, the story ends directly with June when she passed away. In 1998, she passed on in a nursing home in Hoquiam, Washington, which is the next little city over from Aberdeen. So I was still working as a police sergeant. Meanwhile, I had all these files, these things that I put together on June. I'd been doing research, gathering more material, etc., but I really had no idea what to do with it. I had the information, but I hadn't even thought about writing a book or going to a UFO conference. I wasn't sure, what do I do with this? Well, that was answered for me because one night, and it was while I was on duty, but it was an evening where there was snow on the ground and nobody was moving. It was very dark out and not a very good night to be out. I'm sitting in a patrol car down by the river and I've got my AM radio on and Art Bell was on. I would assume you remember Art Bell.
Oh, yes, we do.
The legendary broadcaster who broadcasted on all things paranormal and UFO related from his home broadcast studio in Pahrump, Nevada. I love that name. But anyway, he had two men on his show, Robert Wood and Ryan Wood. And Ryan Wood eventually published a book on UFO crash retrievals, by the way, which is really, really interesting. Well, they were talking about something new that was just coming out then called the Majestic documents, which is another key part of UFO history because there is still a debate about whether or not these are all fraudulent. It was some sort of propaganda stunt to make the Soviets more afraid of us and make them think that we had alien technology. Or maybe the Majestic documents are real, or maybe some of them are real and the rest of them are fake. Take your pick. But at that particular time, these documents were new. They talked all about them. I was totally blown away and fascinated because they're talking about, crash retrieval procedures and protocols for handling alien bodies and all of this. And I'm thinking, this is good stuff. They had a phone number to call in. So next day when I was home off duty, I called this phone number and I said, "Hi, I'd really like to get copies of those Majestic documents," because that's what the number was set up for. "But, oh, by the way, I'm a police officer up here in the Pacific Northwest, and I've got audio tapes and government service records, and I knew a lady who worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base who talked to me about recovered alien bodies and crash saucers and a whole lot of things that the Majestic documents are all about." I get a phone call back. They wanted to know, they said, "Could you fly to Southern California?" And I said, "Well, yes, I could, but I'd have to use vacation time and I hadn't really planned on it." And they said, "Well, we're paying and we're hoping that you'll come down here." And it turned out there was a man named Joe Firmage. I think he was one of what they called the .com millionaires. And he was 28 years old and he had $28 million. And I think the sad truth is he managed to blow all of it. But that happens. He had put up $1 million to research the UFO question. And that's what was bankrolling what happened next. They actually flew Joanne down with me as a research assistant because when they asked me to go down there, I said, "Well, I usually don't go anywhere without my wife." And they asked me about her. And I said, "Well, she's a librarian and she has 2 master's degrees." And they said, "Great, we'll include her as a researcher." So Joanne and I are off to Newport Beach in California, and we end up at this real exclusive high-end Hyatt resort. And I walk in and I sit down in this room with these people, and I'm like blown away. I'm there with Linda Moulton Howe. Stanton Friedman was supposed to be there and couldn't make it. Paul Davids was there. Jim Mars was there. Hal Puthoff, whose name is still around because he's one of those.
Yeah.
He works on all the black projects for the U.S. government. He was there in this room, and everybody was there to present a different aspect of the UFO phenomena, and they wanted to include the June story. They were so impressed by the June story and my background to back it up. They thought, wow, we're going to put this in the mix. And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I mean, it was unreal. And I told my story. I remember Linda Howe was there, and she passed around these pieces of metal. And they're the same pieces of metal that Tom DeLonge and company were bragging about a while ago. Pieces of the saucer. Well, they got them from Linda Howe. It's the same metal. I know it is because I handled it.
Huh.
An anonymous party mailed it to Art Bell when she was doing a series of UFO-related radio programs, and they get this little box with metal fragments in it and this letter that isn't signed that says, "This is from Grandpa's box." Grandpa was assigned to the Southwest, and he was in the Army, and this is something he collected. And I know he wasn't supposed to have it. I'm not supposed to have it, so I'm giving it to you, but I'm not going to tell you who I am because I have a pension. And I looked, and they explained this metal. It was alternating layers of magnesium and bismuth metal. And they had sent it to 4 different metallurgy labs. And everybody says, this is not natural. Somebody manufactured this. To this day, nobody knows who manufactured it or why. But I got to handle this, and I'll tell you what, maybe it was just the circumstances, but it creeped me out.
Was it
'cause
anything like what June described of her medal?
yeah, kind of,
Hmm.
because it was alternating layers of bright and dull.
Hmm.
And one lab had tried to recreate it. They managed to stick together 3 or 4 layers of metal, but then they fell apart. Whoever made this stuff got them to bind perfectly. And it looks like something somebody made, but nobody can tell you who it is. And according to what now they showed a video, but the video's not verified. I don't know who did the video or where or under what conditions. But they claim that if you put it on a glass surface and you charge this plate electrically, that the metal would float over the surface. And they showed it. They said that by changing these frequencies at any end of this plate, they could make this thing move any direction they wanted to. Well, you don't, obviously we all know where that might have gone, or where it might have come from.
Right.
So I think the clues are all there right in front of us. And June was just one of the many witnesses. Don Schmidt and Tom Carey, they've used the June story in a couple of their books with my permission as being one of the key corroborating witnesses. They've listed over 600 witnesses with interlocking testimony that supports the idea that some type of craft crashed outside of Roswell, New Mexico in the July 4th weekend of 1947, and very probably it's not from this world. And that part I'm pretty sure of. And the U.S. military went to a hell of a lot of trouble to lie about it, cover it up, probably because they didn't have any idea what they're dealing with either, and they didn't want to admit it. They don't want to admit that there's something that makes them feel powerless and stupid.
Well, I was also going to say that of those 600 witnesses, it'd be interesting to know how many of them were threatened.
Probably not that many.
And then on top of that, when you say the military didn't know what they had, well, I think that's why the cover-up started, because they knew they found out that they had little aliens, and they needed to cover it up.
And then part of it, in all honesty, if you look at what happened in 1947 when this story got loose in the media, this is one of the first signs that the public can be put into panic mode like that. Unfortunately, people can act really nobly and with a great deal of courage and with intelligence, but when humanity turns into a mob, there isn't anything uglier or dumber.
Yeah.
I've seen riots as a policeman, and they're scary. And we've seen how social media, how stories that have no basis in fact, no supporting evidence, nothing tangible, can catch fire on the internet, and suddenly people are saying, I know that that's true. They don't know any such thing because they heard somebody tell them about it on some social media channel, and they don't even know who they're talking to. And yet they pretend that it's fact. It's not. But when you do research, you do the best you can to try and ferret out truth from falsehood. I am convinced that June was a very sincere person, and she was trying to tell her life story, knowing that she was coming to the end of her life. And she told me the limitations of her knowledge, as well as telling me what she did recall. And it's important because it fits into an even more important, bigger whole story.
And now that official information lies where?
I'm sorry.
Well, you had said you had given all the information and the paperwork away, or you still have that?
I still have it.
Oh, you still have it. Okay.
Oh yeah, I have my copies of everything.
Right. And okay. Thank you.
No.
Just want to make sure.
No,
Well,
I never gave any of that away. Certainly not. I made lots of copies too. And by now they're spread all over the place. So, taking them from my house wouldn't do you any good. It wouldn't stop the June story.
That's good. And
I've never been, to be honest, I always get asked this. Have you been threatened or have you been followed around? What do I really know that they would waste their time following me around or bothering me?
Right.
If I had a surveillance van parked outside of my house, you know what I would do? I'd go up and tap on the window and say, "Hey, the coffee pot's on. Why don't you come inside?" I was a cop for too many years. I talk shop with them. I mean, it's the same job essentially, no matter where you do it. Yes, there is a cover up. Yes, there have been terrible threats made. I believe that's all true. And it's a very scary thing. And those people were being totally unprofessional and they were way, way out of line. There's no excuse for treating another person that way, ever.
Right. Well, June, you have done June's bidding and spreading her story and making sure it gets out, and you're still continuing that. We are so happy and delighted that you were able to come on with us and again tell June's story. And we did want you to also talk about the Westport crash retrieval, but we're short on time. So you'll come back, talk to us again, right?
I would love to.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate that. And again, it's been such a delight to have you on, James. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.